Hi there, and welcome to Social Capital Matters. I'm your host, Kylie Taylor. On this show, we take a deep dive into the ideas around social capital by talking to business and industry leaders about how they use it to collaborate with stakeholders and build a framework for long-term success. Hi everyone, welcome to episode 1 of Social Capital Matters. I'm here in Melbourne, and joining me from Bangkok is my producer, Greg Jorgensen. Greg, are you there?
Hey Kylie, thanks. Great to be here. Things are looking good in Bangkok today. It's a nice day, but I'm excited to get the show started. We've got a really interesting guest and it should be a fun chat.
Great, well let's get started. We've got a great discussion today because we'll be talking to one of the most interesting and insightful people I know. A guy who can look at a completely random set of data and draw valuable insights into future trends that can really help shape your business decisions. He can probably set up exactly what he does better than I can. So let's get him on the call and get started. Our guest on this episode is David Black, founder and CEO of Blackbox, one of the world's leading research and advisory firms. David, welcome to Social Capital Matters.
Kylie, hello. Good to see you. Thank you for inviting me.
So look, before we get started, why don't you tell everyone a little bit more about what Blackbox does?
I would be delighted to. Blackbox is a polling firm based here in Asia, here in Singapore. I've lived in Singapore for over 20 years now. Before that, worked in politics, political polling, policy, those sorts of things, working in Australia and New Zealand. These days, the firm has a footprint right across the Asian region, and we do what we call, we specialize in what we call decision intelligence, which is really my desire or aim is to try and better connect a lot of the data that's out there with, I guess, real world applications, real world outcomes, rather than just, relying simply on the numbers, looking at them in a stark format. And so most of the time we help clients to sort of bridge that gap, whether it be governments, large companies, NGOs, etc. So, yeah, I'm in the better decisions game.
David, that actually reminds me of how we first met each other. Do you remember when we first met?
I do, unfortunately. Not insofar it was lovely to meet you, but it was just so long ago. Yeah, the late 90s, I think.
It was.
Here in Singapore, yeah.
Yeah. We were both doing work for Visa, the payments card company at the time, across Asia.
I think so, yeah.
And look, what I remember about back then is we were going across all the markets in Asia. We were going from Japan and China right through Southeast Asia and off to India. And we were looking at consumer perceptions around culture, around financial payments, banking, family attitudes to money, to really get a really deep understanding of the social context of financial services at that time. And that was really my first exposure to the sort of research you do. And I've relied on it ever since to help me understand the social context of whatever sector I'm working in or whatever client I'm working for. But that was 25 years ago. You're right. That was a little while ago. You had a little less grey hair then. But look, over the last 25 years, I think it's true to say that you and I have had a ringside seat to everything that's been happening in these markets. So I can't think of anyone better to talk to than yourself, who's more expert on the social context in Asia. So tell me, what is different now, David? What are the key differences that you're seeing?
I guess a simple answer to that is everything is different. But let me just try and look at it, I guess, through both a kind of regional lens and then looking at Asia through a global lens. I think the first thing I would say is that when I first met here, there was still that legacy that, certainly in the business world, that the kind of idea of Western perspectives being seen as paramount or overriding. I think hasn't disappeared, but it is disappearing very, very fast. the kind of idea that Western wisdom in business, first and foremost, is best in the region. I think that's disappearing, and I think you only have to see that in a very practical way, without getting technical. Whether it's something like the advancement of Chinese technology in the business world and Chinese products, from TikTok, to different products. You can look at it through Korean culture. Turn on your television and see how many Korean shows are on the streaming platforms. And then you can look at it as well through, say, something like Japanese ingenuity, which, some of us sort of grew up with, but now is just dominates all the time. So even just through those three cultures, you can see the kind of superiority of Asia in a lot of different ways, and that continues to grow and advance and be enhanced. We're now starting to see it in places like Indonesia as well, certainly in this region, Southeast Asia. I think there's more startups now, or what they call unicorns, I guess, in Indonesia than almost anywhere else in the region. And so it's pretty different to the past. The second thing I would say is, like elsewhere, this idea, I think, with younger people now, this distinction between what we would call the left and the right, or what we used to call the left and the right, like in a lot of other places, and I would include where you are in Australia here, I don't think that distinction even means anything anymore. And so for me, the binary now for younger people is success or failure. And, whether it's in a political, a social, or a business context, they're built and they've grown up around the idea of, success and what that looks like. And they'll take it in whatever form is dished up. So I think a lot of those old constructs that we carried over from the post-war era have certainly disappeared. And, that's making a huge difference, particularly with an aspirational generation now emerging in Asia, where you've got a huge growing middle class. A lot of those old constructs have just disappeared.
It's really interesting. A lot of the work we've done over the years has been through what I call sort of the rest of Asia. Everything sandwiched between China on one hand and the West on the other hand, a sort of in-between world. And, we've certainly always seen this aspiring to the idea of Western democracy, Western capitalism, Western freedoms, Western brands. And of course, a lot of that came about because a lot of young people went and lived in Western countries to go to university, for example. But at the same time, there was also a very strong allegiance to Asian heritage and sort of proud of the grandfathering effect of China in the region as being a real leader in science, technology, and commerce. Would you say that's still true, or has that changed as well?
Oh, it's changed a lot, I think. Again, like I said at the start, I think everything has changed. Asian countries are a lot more confident now about controlling and following their own destinies, their own paths. I think they're really suspicious, if not outrightly critical, of kind of pronouncements that come from, the traditional kind of Western sources. And it's not always government. A lot of the time it's NGOs, newspapers or media outlets, or even NGOs. So I think there's a lot of suspicion about that. And, I see, it doesn't matter where you go now, the level of sort of self-empowerment, self-actualization, confidence, these are commonplace now across the region, and openly confident, I think. And that's how I guess it should be. The other thing I would say is that I think one thing the West often gets wrong about this part of the world is the sort of sense of that Western countries have this kind of monopoly on progressiveness. And so one thing I observe, and I certainly talk to clients about, is there's a lot of progress and what I would call progressive attitudes in this part of the world. But the difference is a lot of people in this part of the world are not shouty about it. A lot of the time this progressiveness sort of is a kind of a stream that runs under the surface. And so it's definitely evident. Attitudes and culture does not stand still, and those things are there, but you've got to look and listen a lot harder to sort of see it. and not expect that it's going to be sort of shouted from the rooftops like it is in some places. The other thing I would say is that, there's a reactive element as well. I mean, I think if you look at the initial stages of COVID, even going back to the global financial crisis, there is a kind of increasing cynicism about, these solutions or ideas coming from other places that are somehow always correct. And one thing I've been observing recently is I think that this current fall of big tech, we're seeing certainly in the last week or so, huge job losses. And I think that will only accelerate that kind of sense of this idea that Western supremacy, is paramount. Increasingly, it's seen as illusory. And I think this tech thing is a very, very important shift, because if you look at the companies that have dominated our economy over the last 10 or 15 years, now that those guys look a lot more human than they did in the past and a lot more frail, I think that will change a lot more attitudes, both in this region and probably other places like Africa and South America as well.
Yeah. I think when you talked about looking under the surface for the progressiveness, I think a lot of Singapore, because the more you dig into it and look at it, the number of things Singapore is investing in, a number of things that the government is investing in, are leaders in renewable technology, alternative proteins. I think there's been a lot done, for example, in what I call the fake meat sector. There's a lot of very progressive work coming out of Southeast Asia and Singapore in particular in that area.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, firstly, I think, if you haven't looked at or explored Singapore for over a decade and you're hanging on to older views, those views are now outdated. And everyone I meet who comes to Singapore now who hasn't been here for a long time, they are just completely gobsmacked. It is and it's not just the crazy rich Asian look and feel of the place, which is, fantastic. It's also just the vibrancy and the change in overall society here. You're right about the kind of plant-based meat alternative. Singapore, has been a huge champion of that for a time and is probably leading the world, not just really in the consumption thing, but in terms of promoting and developing businesses around the world that are going to champion that. So Singapore has been at the front, as it has in other areas. I mean, if you look at urban planning, urban development, the way kind of urban constructs are emerging now in the world, Singapore's a huge role model for a lot of different societies in terms of how do you get that balance right. In these urban settings, which now dominate our lives. I'd also point to places like, Indonesia at the moment. I think underestimated and underreported in a Western context. President Jokowi has, in my view, been an enormously transformational figure, and demonstrated what you can achieve through common sense, good politics, good policy, and good people around you. Now, whether that will be sustainable moving forwards, who knows? I mean, he's got a limited term there, but I don't think, it really deserves more commentary. It has been a huge change. And I'd also say I think if you look at the commentaries in and around China in the last decade or so, which is always through a geopolitical lens, I think it's sometimes misunderstood. And I alluded this to before, China, Korea, and that they wield enormous soft power now around the world in the same way, say, a France or an Italy did through, the last 40 or 50 years. Those two countries do wield a lot of soft power. And, in many ways, to me, it's well in front of the kind of hard power construct. So they are very influential. So, look, there are so many things happening here, which I think, are appreciated, but sometimes I don't think they're necessarily well reported or as widely reported as they could be.
So, David, when you're talking to some of your clients that are probably global corporates from outside the region, what are you telling them now about how to conduct themselves in this part of the world? Do you have sort of some key guidelines you give them on how to keep up with all the changes?
Yeah, very much, that, it's the same as, in a lot of other places, that, corporates need to be a lot more self-aware. I'll come back to this in a few minutes. I won't maybe answer it with this question, but apart from just the self-awareness, is the kind of you see it in so many forums, that inability to really understand at the level of tone deafness. And, take something like COP27 on at the moment. I mean, just so many parties there are still completely unable to read the room, or at least unwilling to read the room. So I think the advice I'm giving people is you have to go to places and act as you find them, and adjust accordingly. The old 20th century, will come in, copy and print. It doesn't work anymore. And it probably never should have worked, but it certainly doesn't work now. So, but there isn't a simple answer. There isn't a template I can give clients. Every sector's different, markets are different, but there are some basic tenets that I've talked about, and I think those really start with, keeping your eyes and your ears open just to begin with, and a willingness to learn from the outset and then go from there. In the past, there wasn't even that. People were coming with their preset ideas, and then wondering why they were getting nowhere.
Yeah. Look, I think that's really good advice. I think the point about reading the room is critical. All the companies we're working with are finding that things aren't what they expected. Everything is more complex, it's more interconnected, and there are those huge ESG demands that are coming from consumers, they're coming from customers, they're coming from investors, and they're increasingly finding the need to look at every single decision through the widest possible stakeholder lens. So,
Right.
What you said about listening and getting out to as many of your stakeholders as possible and really listening to what they're saying has to be a critical part of getting out there and getting on the right foot.
Very much. Look, in addition to business clients, I do a lot of work with regulators in the region as well, which is an important work because regulators always, in terms of, the work I do, insights work, regulators are good clients because they do, by necessity, have to speak to an awful lot of stakeholders. When a regulator makes a decision, it's got to take into account a whole community or a whole sort of social group to I think my observation, and my work in this area, is that I think certainly global companies, and I don't mean Western Fortune 500, I mean all global companies, whether you come from India, whether you come from Brazil, United States, the EU, China, or whatever, the idea you have to become global at the top as well. So I think you're seeing this now to some extent. You're seeing a greater diversity in CEO profiles. But if you really look deep down with women, racial diversity on boards, senior management, that is still sort of coming through. But it's not just the people as well. I think also if you stick to what I call that Ivy League business school playbook, that's a problem as well. And so one of the problems I'm seeing now is as we emerge into this new 21st century world, where we've got a lot more issues. I mean, climate change is your classic example. Trying to bolt on solutions or approaches onto that 20th century model are proving difficult. And the end result of that is this whole kind of criticism of virtue signaling and whatever else. In fairness to some organizations who are criticized of virtue signaling, I don't think they're necessarily always doing it deliberately. Some are, some aren't. I think it's more to do with the kind of structures that they've got in place. So I think they've got to become a lot more conscious, and this goes back to my point about listening, of kind of underlying bias. It's not just a communications issue. This runs much deeper. And I think we're going through the pangs of, or the pain points of that at the moment. And, you would expect in the next decade that that's going to will emerge out of that one way or another in a different format. But that's what I'm sort of seeing at the moment. I'm a little suspicious about the over-reliance on virtue signaling because I think some companies are being genuine. They're just they're just hopeless at what they're doing because they're not really looking at the underlying issues in the first place.
Yeah. What you made me think about was the interconnectedness of all things. And that adds to the complexity because increasingly, no matter where a company is, its supply chain at some point is passing through Asia, probably. And there are issues around aspects of its supply chain, which is either how it sources material, how it engages with local workers, that they're realizing have a bigger impact on their overall business. And I mean, a lot of the issues that I can think about from the past 10 years or so, they've always either been something to do with trying to virtue signal, but being very tone deaf. And the example I can think of is Dolce & Gabbana's ads in China that came across as completely racist, and they had to bring them down. Or things like the collapse of Rana Plaza in Bangladesh. Now, that isn't a Bangladesh issue. That becomes a global issue because we very quickly understood where Benetton was made and who was making it and how they were making it. And, you know, something that was closer to home for me out of Australia, the public backlash against the way live cattle were treated in Indonesia had huge ramifications on the Australian cattle and live export industry and cost the livelihoods of many farmers because the government decided to take action. So I think we're seeing I'm certainly seeing a greater interconnectedness of an issue in one part of the world has big flow-on effects right through the supply chain. And so that really does highlight the need to understand those stakeholders and who you're dealing with and make sure you really get it right at every step of the way.
Sure. I mean, even in a much broader context, I saw it from the Chinese as well with their Bridge and Road initiative in this
Good
part of the
example.
world. You know, fantastic intentions, visionary, all those sorts of things. But, you know, the delivery and the execution of it was dubious in a lot of different places. And so now they've had to, apart from COVID, they're going back now and re-looking at that. And I think, whatever they come up with in terms of those sorts of initiatives in the future will be different. What you're talking about, though, in my view, goes to exactly what I was saying before, that the corporate world itself is in transition. And it's in pain at the moment. And I think that's what's not being acknowledged a lot of the time. The corporations, as we understand them, are a construct of the 19th and the 20th century. And we've now got these enormous global 21st century problems. And I don't know if corporate structures are built for purpose anymore. And I think too often, certainly in our world, Kylie, where we work, a lot of these things, companies will come to you and think that they can solve this through, it's a communication solution that comes, when of course, it runs much deeper. If I was to really be honest with you and say, well, which are the best companies that, who are the standard bearers? I mean, you can point to companies like Patagonia and, dozens of others who've been doing good things. But my real view is that there is I hate to say this, but I don't think there's a true shining light on any stock, at the top of any stock exchange in the world. Where I think we will see change is from those hundreds of thousands of startups we've now seen emerged in the digital era. And, these things it will be evolutionary, that somehow there will emerge from, this period of time a kind of a new approach which will then take hold and will build a kind of philosophy and whatever else. And so I think we just have to suffer for the moment. It's not going to be a top-down solution. There will be top-down answers given, but I think truly the change will come from bottom up. You will have this new breed of companies, doing different things, talking different ways. And, eventually we will see that start to come through, and then that will start to influence academia and whatever else. So I have sympathy for the business world at the moment, insofar as I think it's really struggling with what it is, its own identity. We live in the age of identity. I think companies really are suffering under that, but they have to look kind of much deeper. But of course, It's hard because you can't just change yourself. Your expectation is if I change first, I'll suffer, and everybody else moves forward. So it's going to have to be a kind of a stream of change that will eventually happen because no single company will do it itself.
Yeah, I think when you were talking, I was thinking of these future 25-year-olds or today's 25-year-olds who are doing the startups, who are young, often from Asia, and they're starting from scratch with some of this thinking. Whereas the entrenched companies, for them, they're trying, a lot of them are trying really hard, but it's like turning the Titanic around. So we are going to see a lot more interesting things in this space. Well, David, I could talk to you all day long, but we don't have all day. Before we wrap up, have you got any final thoughts about future shifts and how not to get left behind? I'm sure our listeners would love to hear that.
Well, firstly, I think you've listened to me all day long, so I don't believe that. But I guess my final thought is to sort of keep it in the gist of the conversation is that, we need to now really swing for the future rather than hold on to the past. And I'm not looking at that in a real political way. I think you have to look at it through the lens of young people and societies as well. My own view is that a lot of the things we hold on to as important, certainly, I keep going back to the 20th century, but, we need to understand we're only 20 years into this one. I think a lot of those things that we hold as sacred will prove over time to simply be anachronistic. The things that we think are really solid and that, dissipate quite quickly. I mentioned the left and right thing before. I mean, it's astonishing if you go around different places, just how that has just sort of disappeared entirely. I see a lot of the current issues. I think too often they're portrayed as a kind of clash of cultures, and I don't think they are. I think if you go to something like, if you go to science, science itself, a fundamental is really, I think, changing who we are and what we will become. And so for me, I think we need to kind of harness and better understand, sooner rather than later, about what sort of is in front of us. Because if we don't get it right now, certainly in the next decade or so, there is a possibility we will skip generations, and a lot of what we're looking for may not happen until the next century. That's what worries me at the moment, is that, that you can't just sort of say, well, we'll get it right in 10 or 20 years. We may not have that time. We may lose it all, and it then will. And that's happened historically. We've seen that in the past, where centuries go by, nothing happens, and then you have to wait for another century for something. So I don't want to see that. So I think swing now and move on. That's going to be a really important lesson for all of us.
Well, that is a great place to end, with that strong call to arms. So, David, great to talk to you. Lovely to see you. And we'll talk again soon, but not in 25 years, much sooner than that.
Eiley, thanks so much for having me, and lovely to see you again.
Cheers. Well, Greg, that was a really interesting discussion with David, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was really fantastic. He's a really well-spoken guy, clearly knows his stuff, really interesting to listen to. I was sitting quietly here, listening on, but some really cool insights. One thing that really stuck out for me was when he said that, the shouty West. It's a common thing when you live here in Asia, and the difference between Asian culture and Western culture. Western culture is very loud and in your face, blah, blah, blah. And Eastern cultures are sort of quieter and more reserved. And I think that when you look through a Western lens at Asian culture, it's easy to assume that things aren't happening, but they are. They're happening under the surface, but they might not be obvious right away, but they're still moving forward. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, and the message about greater self-actualization, that we're potentially going to see some very strong businesses, ideas, innovation emerging from this part of the world. And his call to action to move with change and move quickly, I think it's really relevant for a lot of the work we're doing and a lot of the work of our clients.
Yeah, you're right. He made a good point too. It's not easy. And like you said, the first person is always nervous about saying, oh, I'm going to get caught up and tripped up in this and everyone else is going to blame me. But, I don't know how many hands are going to shoot up saying I'll be the first one to volunteer. But he makes a very good point. You have to do it sometime.
Exactly, exactly. Well, look, that's a great lead into our next episode. So thanks for listening, everyone. Our next episode, we want to look behind the scenes of the media. I'm not going to tell you yet who our next guest is going to be, but we're going to look behind the scenes at the media and the choices and challenges they now have in trying to identify things like greenwashing and to make sure they're a part of a solution and not part of a problem. So that'll be a really interesting discussion for next time on Social Capital Matters. Thank you. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Social Capital Matters has been a production of Baldwin Boyle Group, hosted by Kylie Taylor and produced and edited by Greg Jorgensen. Find more episodes in our ongoing series on baldwinboyle.com/podcasts, watch on YouTube, or listen wherever you find your podcasts.